What happened to the Dyatlov Pass hikers? In February 1959, 9 experienced Soviet hikers set off to explore the northern Ural Mountains. But a month later, they were found dead in a remote part of the mountain range, their tent cut open from the inside. The case quickly became a sensation across the USSR, and although official investigations were conducted, no real answers were ever given. So what did happen to them? Was it a man-made disaster, or something more sinister? Let's take a look at some possible explanations for this strange occurrence. We tend to think of the Soviet Union as a monolithic block of repressive authorities, and it was. But the fact is there was a huge amount of variation between the different republics that made up the USSR. For example, the Ukraine had a long tradition of folk beliefs and magic which were anathema to the ruling Communist Party. Yet despite such differences being erased by the regime, people still clung to these traditions. For many ethnic minorities within the Soviet Union, religion was replaced with nature worship, and shamans continued to practice their craft in secret. It's even believed that a black magic cult existed in the Ukraine throughout the Cold War, and so it isn't surprising that when the news broke about the Dyatlov Pass incident, rumors began to spread that the hikers had been murdered in a ritualistic sacrifice. These rumors were only bolstered when Yuri Yudin, one of the few survivors, claimed that he had seen a mysterious glowing light above the trees near where the hikers had set up camp, before becoming ill and having to leave the group. But while such claims made sensationalist headlines around the world, they were never substantiated. And Yudin later admitted that he may have actually been hallucinating due to oxygen starvation. But if it wasn't a man-made disaster, then perhaps it was caused by animal predators. After all, the area is home to bears and wolves, both of which could account for the injuries sustained by the victims. However, this theory also quickly fell apart. Despite extensive searches of the area, no tracks or other signs of predators were ever found. Furthermore, some of the bodies showed signs of extensive bruising, suggesting that they had been beaten, which would make little sense if they had been attacked by animals. Some sources even claimed that some of the victims had female genitalia, which would seem to rule out any involvement from large carnivores. While others pointed out that if the perpetrators were wolves, it's likely that the tent would have been torn down, but it was found relatively intact. So instead, maybe the killer wasn't an animal at all, but a human one. After all, one of the hikers was missing, and 3 others had serious injuries, leading to speculation that there had been a fight within the group. It was even rumored that the hikers had been betrayed by their own guide, a man named Gerasim Klevikin, who had been hired to lead the expedition. There were certainly reasons for suspicion. Klevikin had a criminal past, having been sentenced to 5 years in prison for theft, and he had reportedly argued with several members of the group, including Dyatlov himself. He was also the last person to be seen alive with the group, and according to his story, he had left them a week before they died after suffering from altitude sickness. However, investigators failed to find any evidence to support these claims, and ultimately, Kryvokin was cleared of any wrongdoing. But even though no single explanation has ever satisfied everyone, there are 2 theories that come closer than any others. The first is that the group's deaths were caused by an avalanche. After all, avalanches are fairly common in the region, and a sudden wall of snow could easily explain how the tent came to be cut open. This is supported by the fact that 8 of the 9 victims had traumatic injuries consistent with being hit by a large mass of snow. Furthermore, an eyewitness did come forward claiming that she had seen an avalanche in the area on the morning of February, just as Dyatlov and his friends would have been making their way down the mountain. But even though an avalanche seems like a plausible explanation, there are still some problems. First of all, witnesses reported good weather conditions in the days leading up to the incident, which would make an avalanche unlikely. And secondly, avalanches usually only bury their victims, whereas the Dyatlov group was found lying on the surface of the snow. What's more, one of the victims had a serious head wound, which wouldn't have been caused by snow. And the bodies showed signs of being exposed to low temperatures for several days, which wouldn't have happened if they'd been buried under a wall of snow. With that in mind, it seems like we're left with only one possible culprit, a sudden slab of rock known as a rock. Rock slides can move incredibly fast, and they do often break through tents, which fits with the evidence at the scene. Furthermore, rock slides can sometimes be triggered by avalanches, explaining why no avalanche was witnessed in the days before the incident. But while it does seem like a rock slide is the most likely cause of the disaster, it still doesn't explain why the victims had such severe head wounds or why some of their bodies were partially clothed. Even so, it makes sense that an official investigation reached the same conclusion. When the Soviet government learned about the Dyatlov Pass incident, they weren't willing to let it become a full-blown scandal. That's why the investigation was carried out so swiftly and thoroughly, and those responsible for carrying it out were hand-picked by the government. They included experts from all over the USSR, as well as high-ranking military officers. Even the judge who oversaw the hearings was brought in from another city. To be fair to the investigators, they did do their best to follow the evidence wherever it led. It's clear from the transcripts of their interviews that they considered every possibility and eliminated each one until they were left with only 2 viable theories: a rock slide or an avalanche. However, while they ultimately decided that an avalanche was most likely, they stopped short of closing the case. Instead, they simply declared that the group had died from traumatic injuries sustained during an avalanche, which left their tent torn and their bodies scattered. This vague statement allowed them to keep the case open without admitting any wrongdoing on behalf of the government. But they went even further than that, ordering that all of the case files be sealed and that anyone with access to them would face prosecution. As you can imagine, the families of the victims weren't happy about this, especially as they hadn't even been informed that the case was closed. They demanded to know what had really happened to their loved ones, and why the case was being kept under wraps. But their questions were ignored and they had no choice but to accept the government's explanation. And that might have been the end of it, except for the fact that the case attracted the attention of a journalist named Corny Chow. Corny was one of the few people in the USSR who was unafraid to speak truth to power. And so he decided to write an article detailing the circumstances surrounding the case and hinting at a cover-up. His piece was published in 1968, and it immediately put him in the crosshairs of the KGB. He was harassed, arrested, and sent to a mental institution, all in an effort to get him to recant his claims. But he refused to back down, insisting that he was right to question the official story. Unfortunately for him, he was right. But it took another 30 years before the truth finally came out. In 1991, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, 2 Russian academics were given access to the Dyatlov Pass files, and what they found was shocking. After combing through the documents, they concluded that not only was the avalanche theory wrong, but that the entire investigation had been flawed. For starters, they discovered that the head of the medical commission had falsified his credentials. He wasn't a doctor at all, and the forensic analysis was completely wrong. The time of death had been miscalculated by as much as 2 weeks. What's more, one of the main pieces of evidence used to convict the hikers of being drunk had been tampered with, and the autopsy reports contained obvious mistakes, such as failing to mention that one of the victims was missing a kidney. Clearly, the whole investigation had been a rushed job, and those in charge had been willing to ignore anything that challenged their narrative. But they also uncovered evidence that there had been another cover-up, this time on behalf of the military. You see, the incident happened close to a military base, and there were fears that the soldiers there may have been involved somehow. But any suggestion that the soldiers had anything to do with the disaster was swiftly stamped out. One witness, a woman named Zinaida Kolmogorova, had claimed that she saw soldiers in the area on the night of the incident, but her testimony was ignored and she was branded a hysterical liar. In fact, the KGB went so far as to forge evidence to support their claims. When a search party went out looking for bullet casings, they returned empty-handed, so someone forged some shell casing and planted them near the bodies. This was done to prove that the group had been murdered by soldiers, thus deflecting suspicion away from the military. But despite this conspiracy, there is no evidence that soldiers were involved in any way, and it seems like they were simply trying to protect themselves. In the end, the case remains officially unsolved, but there is one person who believes he knows what really happened. Igor Dyatlov was the leader of the group, and he was also the one who died with the most injuries. But unlike the others, he didn't die right away. He managed to survive for 8 days after being injured, and it was his diary entries from this time which shed new light on the incident. When investigators combed through his belongings, they found that someone had removed some of the pages from the diary, but eventually they got their hands on the missing entries and they revealed a shocking conclusion. According to his own writing, Dyatlov had been injured in a rock slide, and he and his companions had survived the initial impact only to have their tent collapse hours later. He wrote that the group had huddled together for warmth after realizing they were in grave danger, and that he had woken up sometime later to find the tent had been sliced open by rocks. With no other options, the group had fled into the blizzard, but most of them became disoriented and lost. Dyatlov himself had managed to find shelter in a tree well, but the cold had seeped into his bones and he knew he would die, and that's exactly what happened. It may never be possible to say for sure what happened to the Dyatlov Pass hikers, but one thing is certain, their story will continue to fascinate for generations to come.